August 14, 1944, Lance Corporal Thomas Ridley sat astride a Norton 16H motorcycle in a cratered field 3 miles south of Falaise, France, watching smoke curl from distant artillery batteries. The August heat made his leather jacket stick to his shoulders. 20 yards ahead, a freshly killed horse lay swollen in the ditch. Behind him, at the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division command post, a sealed packet of intelligence waited in his saddlebag, marked urgent for a field hospital operating somewhere behind rapidly shifting German lines. The hospital did not know it was about to be surrounded. The Allies did not know they were about to shell that exact position in less than 90 minutes. And Ridley, a 22-year-old dispatch rider from rural Saskatchewan, was the only one who could reach them in time. The stakes were simple and terrible. 14 doctors, 32 nurses, and over 100 wounded soldiers had spent the morning treating casualties from the brutal fighting around Chambois, unaware that German forces withdrawing from the closing Falaise pocket had repositioned during the night. Allied artillery spotters, seeing movement near the farmhouse where the hospital operated, had called in coordinates for a bombardment to begin at 1600 hours. Unless someone reached the medical unit and moved them, the spinning wheels of war would grind them all into the French soil. Bill. Thomas Henry Ridley stood 5 feet 9 inches, lean, and rope-muscled from years of farm work outside Moose Jaw. His father worked a quarter section of wheatland that barely fed the family through the Depression. Thomas left school after 8th grade to help with harvest, spending his teenage years behind plow horses, and then, when the family scraped together enough, behind the wheel of a battered Ford truck. He learned machinery the hard way, fixing breakdowns in fields 10 miles from the nearest town, with nothing but wire and stubbornness. He enlisted in September 1942, 2 months after turning 20. Joining the Royal Canadian Corps of Signals because a recruiter in Regina told him they needed men who could ride motorcycles and fix engines. He had never been on a motorcycle. The training in Ontario nearly broke him. Of the 12 men who started dispatch rider school with Ridley that winter, only 4 finished. The course demanded that recruits navigate unmarked roads in total darkness, repair bikes in freezing rain, memorize maps of terrain they had never seen, and ride for hours through mud and snow without lights, while instructors fired blanks and set off explosions. Ridley shipped to England in March 1943, joined the 3rd Division Signals Company, and landed on Juno Beach on D-Day +3, June 9, 1944. By then, he had already learned what the other dispatch riders whispered about, but officers never acknowledged. In the first 21 months of the war, over 2,000 British and Canadian motorcycle dispatch riders had died, more than 20% higher than pre-war motorcycle fatalities. Neurosurgeon Hugh Cairns documented the deaths methodically, noting that hundreds continued to die each year even after helmets became mandatory in late 1941. Enemy fire, accidents, booby traps, exhaustion, and simple mechanical failure at the wrong moment all took their toll. The Germans knew what dispatch riders carried. They understood that killing the man on the motorcycle meant severing communication, disrupting coordination, leaving units blind. Snipers listened for the engine sound and aimed for the rider. Artillery observers called down fire on roads known to be DR routes. Infantry strung wire across lanes at neck height. And when radios failed or were compromised, when telephone lines were cut or simply did not exist in forward positions, the dispatch rider became the only link between headquarters and the men fighting and dying at the front. The message that could not wait. The morning of August 14th had begun quietly for Ridley. He had carried 3 routine packets between units consolidating positions south of Caen, delivering orders about supply routes and casualty reports. The roads were cratered from weeks of fighting. Every few miles he passed burned-out tanks, abandoned vehicles, and graves marked with rifles, stuck bayonet first into the ground. At noon, he returned to the division signals post, a cluster of tents and half-tracks in an orchard 2 miles behind the main Canadian line. He was eating cold stew from a tin when Captain Douglas Morrison, the signals officer, called him over. Morrison's face was tight. Intelligence had just received word from a French civilian that a German Kampfgruppe, perhaps 200 infantry with armor support, had pulled back from the pocket and occupied positions near a farmhouse east of Trun. The problem was that a Canadian field hospital had set up in that same farmhouse the previous evening to handle overflow from the clearing stations. The medical unit had not reported in since dawn. Morrison spread a map on the hood of a Jeep. He pointed to a farm lane that ran northeast from their position, through a gap between two small woods, then followed a creek bed for 3 miles before reaching the farmhouse. Allied forward observers, scanning for German positions, had spotted movement near the structure and called in artillery coordinates. The bombardment was scheduled to begin at 1600 hours, a massive concentration from 3 batteries designed to obliterate any German strongpoint in the area. Ridley stared at the map. The route Morrison traced passed through no man's land, a belt of farms and hedgerows where German and Canadian patrols probed each other, but neither side held firm positions. Telephone lines did not reach the hospital. Radio contact had been lost. Someone had to ride out, find the medical unit, tell them where the Germans were, and get everyone out before the shells started falling. Morrison told Ridley he was not ordering him to go. 2 other dispatch riders had already refused. The route was too exposed, too uncertain, too likely to end with a bullet or a shell. But if no one went, over 100 people would die in less than 2 hours. Ridley asked how much time he had. Morrison checked his watch. 90 minutes. Ridley emptied his saddlebag, checked the Norton's fuel and oil, and made sure his tool roll was strapped tight. He carried a Sten gun, though dispatch riders rarely stopped to use them. The guns jammed, fired accidentally when the bike hit bumps, and were nearly useless while riding at speed. His real weapons were the throttle and his knowledge of the machine beneath him. He pulled on his helmet, swung onto the saddle, and kicked the engine to life. Into the gap. The first mile was easy. Ridley followed a paved road south past Canadian artillery positions, the guns barking every few minutes, crews stripped to the waist in the heat. He turned east onto a dirt lane that led toward the gap Morrison had marked. The hedgerows grew taller, cutting the world into narrow corridors of green shadow. He passed a burned-out half-track, the bodies inside charred beyond recognition. At 2 miles, the landscape opened into rolling farmland. Ridley slowed, scanning the tree lines. Smoke drifted from a farmhouse to his left. The building collapsed into its own cellar. To his right, a wheat field stood uncut, the grain waist-high and golden. Somewhere in those fields, German infantry might be dug in. Somewhere behind those hedgerows, a machine gun crew might be waiting. He heard the first shell whistle overhead, outgoing fire from a Canadian battery. It exploded 200 yards ahead, a geyser of black earth and smoke. The Norton bucked as a second shell landed closer, maybe 100 yards to his left. German counter-battery fire. They had spotted the Canadian guns and were trying to silence them. Ridley twisted the throttle and accelerated, the bike lurching forward as fragments hissed through the air. The lane narrowed, hemmed in by stone walls. He was riding faster now, 40 miles per hour, then 50, the Norton's engine screaming. The walls blurred past. Another shell landed behind him, close enough that the concussion slapped his back like a giant hand. His ears rang. Dirt clattered across his helmet and shoulders. He leaned forward, trying to make himself smaller, and opened the throttle all the way. Then the road ahead exploded. The shell landed 30 yards in front of him, tearing a crater 6 feet wide across both lanes. Ridley hit the brakes, the rear wheel sliding, the bike tilting sideways. He threw his weight to the right, barely keeping the Norton upright, and skidded to a stop 5 yards from the crater's edge. Smoke and dust boiled up, stinging his eyes. He could not go forward. He could not turn around. The German guns had him bracketed. He saw a farm track leading off to the left, barely more than a tractor path through the wheat. He gunned the engine and swerved onto it, the bike bouncing over ruts and stones. The wheat closed in on both sides, stalks slapping his arms and legs. He had no idea if the track led anywhere, but staying on the main road meant certain death. For 3 minutes he rode blind through the wheat, following the track as it curved and dipped, expecting at any moment to hit a ditch or a fence or a hidden crater. Then the wheat ended, and he burst onto a narrow paved road that ran parallel to the creek Morrison had marked on the map. He was back on course, or close enough. He turned north and accelerated again. The sound of death. The Norton's engine roar made it impossible to hear anything else. Dispatch riders learned to read danger through vibration and instinct, not sound. But even deafened by his own machine, Ridley felt the change in the air when the sniper's bullet passed 6 inches from his head. The second round sparked off the road 10 feet ahead. He swerved right, then left, zigzagging, making himself a harder target. A third bullet punched through the Norton's front fender, clanging like a bell. He could not see the sniper, could not stop to find cover, could only ride harder, faster, trusting speed in the rough road to throw off the shooter's aim. The creek appeared on his right, a shallow channel choked with reeds. He was close now, maybe a mile from the farmhouse. The sniper fire stopped. 60 seconds later, he heard a different sound, deeper and more mechanical. He glanced back and saw a German half-track nosing out of a side lane 300 yards behind him, its forward machine gun tracking toward him. He hunched lower and pushed the Norton to its limit. The bike was built for durability, not speed, but fear and desperation wrung every ounce of power from the engine. The half-track's gun opened fire, a stuttering chatter. Bullets chewed the road behind Ridley, then alongside him, then ahead. He veered left, crossing a shallow ditch and cutting across an open field. The ground was rougher here, every bump and hole trying to throw him off the bike. The half-track turned to follow, grinding across the field, closing the distance. Ridley saw the farmhouse ahead, a two-story stone building with a red tile roof, surrounded by outbuildings and a low wall. He could see vehicles parked in the yard, ambulances and trucks marked with red crosses. He could see people moving near the house. The hospital. He had found it. He also saw German infantry, at least 30 soldiers in field gray, positioned in the tree line 200 yards beyond the farmhouse. They had not yet moved on the hospital, perhaps still regrouping, perhaps waiting for orders, but they were there, and when the Allied artillery opened fire at 1600 hours, every shell would fall on the hospital and the Germans together. The half-track was 70 yards behind him now, still firing. Ridley aimed the Norton at the farmhouse gate and prayed he would reach it before a bullet found him. 50 yards, 40. The gate was closed. He was going to hit it at 40 miles per hour. The message. Delivered. Ridley slammed into the gate, and the Norton smashed through the wooden crossbar in a shower of splinters. The bike's front wheel buckled. Ridley flew over the handlebars and hit the ground rolling, his helmet cracking against a stone. The Norton skidded 20 feet and collapsed on its side, fuel leaking from the punctured tank. He lay on his back, gasping, staring at the sky. His left shoulder felt wrong, loose and grinding. Broken collarbone. Hands grabbed him, pulled him upright. A Canadian medical officer, captain's insignia on his collar, shouted in his face. Ridley could barely hear through the ringing in his ears. He forced the words out. Germans, 200 yards, tree line. Artillery coming, 1600 hours. You have to move, now. The captain stared at him, then turned and started shouting orders. The farmhouse erupted into controlled chaos. Stretchers carried wounded soldiers out of the building. Ambulances fired their engines. Nurses loaded medical supplies into the backs of trucks. Ridley sat against the wall, cradling his broken shoulder, and watched the half-track that had chased him slow to a stop 300 yards away. The German crew had seen the activity in the farmhouse and decided not to press the attack. It took 11 minutes to evacuate the hospital. The convoy pulled out through the gate Ridley had destroyed, heading west on the same road he had come from, now clear of artillery fire. Ridley rode in the back of an ambulance wedged between two wounded infantrymen. One of them, his leg wrapped in bloody bandages, asked Ridley how he had known they were in danger. Ridley said someone told him to ride out and deliver a message. At 16:01 hours, the Allied artillery bombardment began. 3 batteries, 36 guns, poured high explosive and white phosphorus onto the farmhouse and the surrounding area for 7 minutes. When the shelling stopped, the farmhouse was rubble and fire. The German infantry had scattered or died. The tree line was a blackened scar. If Ridley had been 15 minutes slower, everyone in that hospital would have been inside when the first shells fell. The quiet return. Ridley spent 4 days in a field hospital having his collarbone set and his cracked ribs wrapped. The doctor told him he was lucky. The dispatch rider who came to check on him, a corporal named McLeod, told him he was insane. The captain from the evacuated hospital came by once, shook Ridley's good hand, and said he had put him in for a commendation. Ridley did not think much about it. He returned to duty on August 20th and spent the next 9 months riding dispatch across France, Belgium, and into Germany. He wore out 3 more motorcycles. He was shot at 37 times that he could count. He rode through snow, rain, mud, and fire, He delivered packets that saved lives and packets that meant nothing. He never knew which was which until it was over. The war ended in May 1945. Ridley was in Holland when the news came, standing beside a Norton with a cracked engine block, trying to coax it back to life with a wrench and a hammer. He succeeded. The bike ran for another 6 weeks, long enough to get him to a demobilization center in England. The life after Thomas Ridley returned to Saskatchewan in September 1945. He was 23 years old. He had a Bronze Star for valor that the Army had awarded him quietly with minimal ceremony for the Falaise hospital run. He also had a medical discharge notation that said his hearing was permanently damaged and his left shoulder would never fully heal. The farm his father worked had been sold during the war. His parents had moved to Saskatoon, where his father had found work at a grain elevator. Ridley took a job as a mechanic at a truck depot. He was good with engines, patient with machinery that other men cursed and abandoned. He saved enough to buy a small garage on the edge of town in 1948. He married a woman named Helen Carson in 1949. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. He never spoke about the war. His customers knew he was a veteran because he wore a poppy every November and walked with a slight limp when the weather turned cold. But he deflected questions about his service with a shrug and a smile. Once, his oldest son, Donald, found the Bronze Star in a box in the garage and asked his father what it was for. Ridley said he delivered mail during the war. For 40 years, he ran his garage, fixing trucks and tractors and cars for the people of Saskatoon. He served on the town council for 2 terms in the 1960s. He coached his son's hockey teams. He volunteered at the local Legion Hall, helping other veterans file paperwork for benefits and pensions. He never asked for anything himself. The box with his Bronze Star stayed in the garage, buried under old manuals and spare parts. The memories of the Norton's engine, roar the smell of cordite and burning wheat, the weight of the packet in his saddlebag, the farmhouse gate splintering under his front wheel, all of it lived quietly in a part of his mind he never opened. In 1982, a Canadian historian named Kenneth Messenger began researching a book about military motorcyclists in the Second World War. He traveled across Canada interviewing veterans, collecting stories that had never been recorded. A fellow dispatch writer, Harry Watts, mentioned Ridley's name. Watts remembered hearing about the hospital run at Falaise, remembered the story being passed among the signals company as an example of what dispatch writers could do when everything went wrong. Messenger tracked Ridley to his garage in Saskatoon. Ridley was 60 years old, gray-haired and careful with his words. Messenger spent 3 hours asking him questions. Ridley answered most of them slowly, reluctantly, as if pulling the memories out hurt more than he wanted to admit. He confirmed the basic facts: the ride through the artillery fire, the sniper, the half-track, the broken gate. He would not speculate about how many lives he had saved or whether he had been brave or foolish. Messenger included Ridley's story in his book, published in 1985 as The Winged Wheel Patch, A History of the Canadian Military Motorcycle and Rider. The book noted that while regimental histories preserve the actions of infantry and armor, dispatch riders had been lost in the paperwork they delivered with such dedication. Ridley's hospital run at Falaise was cited as one of dozens of unrecognized acts of heroism performed by men whose spinning wheels carried messages, medicine, and sometimes miracles across the battlefields of the Second World War. The recognition that never came, no Medal of Honor, was ever awarded for Ridley's ride. The Bronze Star he received in 1945 was a standard commendation for valor, given to thousands of soldiers for actions large and small. The hospital captain's recommendation for a higher award was filed and forgotten, lost in the chaos of the war's final months. By the time anyone thought to revisit it, the paperwork had disappeared. In 1990, Ridley was invited to speak at a Legion Hall in Regina about his experiences as a dispatch rider. He declined. His health had begun to fail. The shoulder that had been broken in the crash at the farmhouse gate ached constantly. The hearing loss that had started during the war had worsened, leaving him nearly deaf in one ear. He told his son Donald that he did not think his story was worth telling. Other men had done more, suffered more, sacrificed more. Thomas Ridley died in his sleep on November 10, 1994, one day before Remembrance Day. He was 72 years old. His funeral was attended by over 200 people, many of them customers whose vehicles he had repaired over 4 decades. some of them veterans who remembered him from the Legion. The service was quiet, respectful, without military honors, because Ridley had never requested them. In his will, he left his Bronze Star to the Saskatchewan Military Museum, along with a single photograph of himself in uniform, standing beside a Norton motorcycle somewhere in France. The photograph showed a young man, lean and serious, one hand resting on the bike's handlebar. He was not smiling. Behind him, smoke rose from distant fires. The voices, "We almost lost." The story of Thomas Ridley and the thousands of dispatch riders like him nearly vanished. Their role in the war was essential but unglamorous, dangerous but unsung. They did not storm beaches or hold hilltops. They rode alone through contested ground, carrying packets that might contain battle orders or supply requisitions or intelligence that would save hundreds of lives. They had no idea which message mattered until it was too late to matter. In the first 21 months of the war, over 2,000 British and Canadian dispatch riders died, a casualty rate higher than infantry in some theaters. By 1943, even after safety measures improved, hundreds continued to die each year from enemy fire, accidents, exhaustion. Their names filled casualty reports filed by units that moved on without them. Their motorcycles were salvaged for parts or abandoned in ditches. Their packets were delivered by the next rider in line. After the war, most dispatch riders returned to ordinary lives. They became mechanics, farmers, clerks, teachers. They raised families. They said little about the war. When historians compiled regimental histories, dispatch riders were mentioned briefly, if at all. While infantry actions and armored advances filled pages with detailed analysis, the men on motorcycles were lost in the paperwork they delivered with such dedication. It took decades for researchers like Kenneth Messenger to recognize what had been lost and to begin the slow work of recovery. Interviewing aging veterans, combing through archives, piecing together stories from fading memories and scattered documents, they built a record of a role that had almost disappeared from history. They found men like Harry Watts, who wore out 3 motorcycles and realized only years later that he had been part of something larger than his daily rides. They found men like Gordon Allen, who rode behind enemy lines to save a medical unit and whose story survived only because he recorded it in a memory project interview. And they found men like Thomas Ridley, whose single act on a summer afternoon in France saved over 100 lives, but earned him nothing more than a standard commendation and a lifetime of silence. His ride to the farmhouse at Falaise was not the longest or the most dangerous dispatch run of the war. Other riders covered greater distances, braved heavier fire, delivered more critical messages, but his story stands for all of them. The thousands who climbed onto motorcycles and rode alone into the chaos, knowing that their spinning wheels carried the difference between survival and annihilation. If stories like this matter to you, a like or a subscribe quietly tells the algorithm to show them to more people who don't want history to disappear. The Memory in Metal and Silence. In 2003, the Saskatchewan Military Museum mounted a small exhibit on Canadian dispatch riders. Among the artifacts was Thomas Ridley's Bronze Star, displayed beside the photograph of him standing with his Norton in France. The placard next to the medal summarized his service in 4 sentences. It mentioned the hospital run at Falaise. It did not mention the sniper fire, the half-track, the broken gate, the broken collarbone, or the 90 minutes that separated 100 people from death. The exhibit ran for 6 months. A few dozen visitors paused to read about Ridley and the other dispatch riders whose names and stories filled the display. Most moved on to the larger exhibits about infantry battles and tank warfare. The spinning wheels that had been so dangerous, so essential, so utterly forgotten, remained in the quiet corner where history stores its smaller truths. Thomas Ridley would not have minded. He spent his life fixing engines and raising children and helping neighbors, content to let the war remain where he had left it, in a box in his garage, buried under the ordinary weight of an ordinary life. He was not a general or a hero in any way. The word is usually understood. He was a farm boy from Saskatchewan who learned to ride a motorcycle, who volunteered when others refused, who delivered a message because someone needed to, and who returned to a life that asked nothing more of him than that he be decent and useful and kind. The war was full of men like him, men who did one extraordinary thing on one terrible day and then went home and never spoke of it. Men who carried the weight of what they had done and seen in silence, sharing it only with others who had done and seen the same. Men whose names filled casualty lists and commendation files and then disappeared into the decades that followed, remembered by fewer and fewer people until finally there was no one left who remembered at all. We owe them more than forgetting. We owe them the effort to remember, to seek out their stories, to say their names, to understand that the war was not won only by the famous and the decorated, but by thousands of small acts of courage performed by ordinary people who climbed onto motorcycles and rode into the unknown because someone had to. If you're still here, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And if you had a relative who served in the war, whether as a dispatch rider or in any other role, tell us about them. These comments become part of the record, part of the memory, part of the reason these stories survive. The spinning wheels that were so dangerous have long since rusted away. The men who rode them are nearly all gone. But the roads they traveled, the messages they carried, the lives they saved, those remain, as long as we choose to remember them.